subject matter we'll be discussing is deeply troubling. It includes details that may be disturbing for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. A new report by the Associated Press highlights what seems to be the continuation of forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada. This comes decades after many other rich countries stopped forcefully sterilizing Indigenous women. Numerous activists, doctors, politicians, and at least 5 class action lawsuits allege that the practice has not yet ended in Canada. The Canadian Senate issued a report last year confirming that Indigenous women continue to be sterilized without their knowledge or consent. Documents obtained by the Associated Press shows that a doctor was punished just 2 months ago for forcibly sterilizing an Inuit woman in 2019. We're now joined by the journalist who broke this story, Maria Cheng from the Associated Press. Ms. Cheng, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Some very troubling information in this report, Ms. Cheng. Before we dive right into this, can you clarify to our viewers what exactly the practice of forced sterilization of Indigenous people is and what it looks like in Canada?
Sure. Well, it's a practice that dates back to when eugenics was still in place in Canada and a lot of other countries, when women who were considered inferior were essentially sterilized. But it's a practice that continues to this day under slightly different circumstances, when women, typically after birth, are coerced into this, or they're having some sort of procedure and the doctor or nurse does this without their knowledge, without their consent. So it is shocking that we're talking about this in 2023.
Absolutely shocking indeed, ma'am. So in terms of the research, can you walk us through the documents obtained by the Associated Press around the forced sterilization of Indigenous women? Just how many recent cases have you come across?
It's very hard to tell. I mean, we did speak with a Senator, Yvonne Boyer, who is collecting that data, and they've collected about 12,000 cases, but that is only from one province. So if you think that this is a practice that occurred across Canada, the real number is far higher. The Associated Press had documents about this 2019 case in particular, which was pretty egregious considering that it was other health professionals in the operating room who tried to stop it. So the fact that this happened in 2019 over the objections of other health staff was very concerning.
And considering this horrible practice has ended in other rich countries like the US, how is this disturbing practice continuing in Canada? What is missing in terms of protections for Indigenous women in our country?
It's a very good question, and I think we should talk to more indigenous leaders to see what protections they feel would be necessary to be put in place. I mean, some of the people I spoke to mentioned that there are cultural issues, translation difficulties, the fact that many Indigenous women have to leave their homes to fly hundreds of miles away to give birth, often without family support, without adequate translation, and obviously without enough consent information.
Definitely. And in terms of repercussions, especially when it comes to this 2019 case, the sterilization of an Inuit woman, what was the punishment for the doctor in this case? Have they lost their medical license?
His medical license was suspended for a few months. He was required to take an ethics course, and he was also required to compensate the medical authorities for the cost of the investigation. It is a crime under the criminal code, but at the moment, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has not said whether or not they will investigate this as a criminal matter.
And would you be able to tell us a little bit more about your research into this 2019 case? You mentioned that there were other medical professionals asking this doctor to not move forward with the sterilization. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
The sterilization occurred during a procedure which was meant to address another issue that this woman was having. He had obtained consent to possibly remove one fallopian tube, but to remove the other would leave her sterile, and she had not given permission for that. And the other health professionals were aware of that, and so were very disturbed when the surgeon moved to remove both of those fallopian tubes during the surgery, knowing that she had not consented.
And what have you been hearing from maybe the advocates that you've been speaking to regarding this case and regarding just the issue of forceful sterilization? What needs to be done in Canada, according to them?
Well, when you talk to the Indigenous activists, for one thing, this is not a rare occurrence. This is something that they're very familiar with, and they hear lots of stories about this. It's a practice that clearly has not ended. I think they would like recognition from the Canadian government that this has happened. I mean, Canada has denounced forced sterilization elsewhere in China among the Uyghur women, quite forcefully. and yet it continues within its own borders. I think they would like that acknowledgement. I think they would like greater accountability for those who are doing this, to make sure that they set a precedent that this is not acceptable and it should not be happening in Canada.
Clearly something that needs to be addressed. Ms. Cheng, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
All right, we've got to go to break now, but stay tuned. More news from around the world up next.